all these outsiders were coming in and trying to take over the kingdom. The civil wars between brothers and brothers-in-law and whatever, okay? So the Seleucid kingdom was falling from within even before the Treaty of Apamea happened. So last week we wrapped up the Seleucid Empire. What a mess those people were. We thought the Ptolemies were bad. The Seleucids are probably worse because they had a lot of outsiders come in also into the empire. We talked about that. But this morning I want to talk about a couple of other empires just very briefly. First of all, the Parthian Empire and the Bactrian Empire, two empires that were pretty much chunks of the Seleucid Empire that broke off. The Parthian Empire had a great influence on Roman politics later on. Herod the Great had to deal with Parthia. Mark Antony had to deal with Parthia. Okay, so it was a very giant empire that arose because the Seleucid Empire fell apart. So very quickly I'm going to go through that. It's not that important to us. Remember, we're looking at Palestine. We're always looking at Palestine, who had control of Palestine. The Parthians actually did have control of Palestine for a very short amount of time, from 40 to 39 BC. So I didn't feel like it warranted a full chapter in my book, but I do have a section in the book on Parthia at the end of the Seleucid Empire in chapter 5, I guess it is. So anyway, let's talk about that. So the Parthian Empire is also known as our Seleucid Empire. It was originally a Seleucid province after Alexander the Great died. It started growing during the Seleucid reign of Antiochus II Theos, and we talked about him last week among all the other many rulers of the Seleucids. It came under control of the Seleucids once again during the reign of Antiochus III the Great. We talked about him last week quite a bit. And its greatest extent was in 94 BC. It actually became quite powerful during the time of 53 BC when they actually defeated Rome in the Battle of Carrhae. And it was against the famous Roman consul Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the richest man in the world at that time. He was the Elon Musk of the Roman world back in that time. So he was part of the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey. And after his death at Carrhae, the story goes that he had gold. He was so rich that they poured gold down his throat. Molten gold. Now, I don't know if he was alive. I think the story was that he was dead at that point, but because they wanted to show that his riches meant nothing, they poured gold down his throat when he died. That's the story, at least. So after his death at Carrhae, there were a few years of peace between Caesar and Pompey. Then, of course, we have the Civil War. We talked about Ptolemy the 13th, how he killed Pompey, beheaded him in front of his wife and children when Julius Caesar and Pompey were in civil war. We'll talk about that again later as we talk about Roman history in a few weeks. So we see conflicts in the Parthians and others, as I mentioned, between Mark Antony and Herod the Great, and we'll cover those things as time comes along. So I decided to do another semi-animation. I didn't actually build an animation, but I put all these different charts, 73 total charts in here. And I'm doing from 360 BC, about the time that Philip II came on the scene, the father of Alexander the Great. And I'm going all the way through all the Intertestament history up to 1 BC, to the beginning of the New Testament. We'll start with the Persian Empire, Philip II, Alexander the Great, the rise of the Diadochi, the Ptolemies and Seleucids, and then the fall of the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire in 62 and 30 BC, respectively. And empires contemporary with the Seleucids, the Bactrian, as I mentioned, the Parthian. And I want you to notice as we go along, as we step in time, notice as we get to 190 BC, and then the next step at 185 BC, and notice how the world changes because of the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC. How weak the Seleucid Empire became because of this treaty that Rome forced on them. It was just crushing. And the empire we see just crumble, just fall apart. It's pretty cool in the charts as we go. All right, 360 BC. Starting out, the Persian Empire dominates the entire world, including cold Syria. Rome, not really much there. As we move along, we see stuff going on in the Greek city-states. We see Philip II come along and start consolidating all these Greek city-states. Philip of Macedon starts consolidating. His kingdom gets bigger, and then he dies. Alexander the Great takes over. Now, these charts are every 5 years. And as I mentioned to you before, every 5 years does not give Alexander the Great justice, because you really need a monthly time chart to show what Alexander did during his time. But as we step along, we see Alexander the Great took a big chunk within 5 years, just a couple of years actually. And then 5 years later, boom, Persia was gone. And Alexander the Great had taken over the entire world. We're at 325 BC. 320 BC, Alexander the Great dies in 323, just 3 years earlier than this. And we see the kingdom pretty stable for a time. And then the Diadochi take over. As we step along, 315 BC, 310, 305, and then, boom, everything falls apart. The Seleucids, the Ptolemies, Antigonids, all these Diadochi of Alexander the Great, all these generals of Alexander the Great take over his different parts of his kingdom. And then as we move along through history, 295, we see Rome starting to come on the scene. See how Rome is starting to take over the Italian peninsula. We see the Seleucids expand. This is why the Treaty of Apamea to Rome was so important. Seleucids were a huge, huge empire compared to the Romans, the Roman Republic. That's still the Roman Republic back here at this time. The Roman Empire didn't come about until 27 BC, when Octavian became the first emperor. But the Seleucid Empire was huge and definitely a threat to the growing Roman Empire. So we see as we step along, Rome is taking over the entire Italian peninsula. We then see the Bactrian Empire appear on this little chunk of the Seleucid Empire. Boom, there's Bactria. Seleucids start losing their kingdom. Now, we've not made it to the Treaty of Apamea yet. This is just internal strife. We talked about the civil wars of the Seleucids and stuff. All this stuff they had going on. They had outsiders come in and try to take over and claim to be sons of, like, there was one who claimed to be a son of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, another claimed to be the son of Alexander, I forgot who now. But all these outsiders were coming in and trying to take over the kingdom. The civil wars between brothers and brothers-in-law and whatever, okay? So the Seleucid kingdom was falling from within even before the Treaty of Apamea happened. So the Bactrian Empire comes along, and then next we see up in 250, and then 245, the Parthian Empire come on the scene. Again, a piece of the Seleucid Empire. This Parthian Empire, as we go along, you will see it becomes greater and greater, bigger and bigger as time goes on. So we see Carthage still going on in purple over here in the far west. The Carthaginian Empire is much bigger than the Roman Republic at this time, and the Seleucids is still a huge, huge empire. As we step along, Rome starts getting serious now. We're going to start taking over things. They lose a little territory. Next up, Bactria and Parthia go away under the leadership of Antiochus III the Great of the Seleucid Empire. Remember, he was the zenith. We talked about this last week. He was the zenith of the empire, the Seleucid Empire. Okay? This shows why. He took over Bactria and Parthia, turned them back into Seleucid territory. As we step along in time, Parthia and Bactria appear once again. We start seeing the decline of the Seleucid Empire. We start getting to the later civil wars of the Seleucids. Okay? Pieces of the kingdom start breaking off. Bactria first, and then Parthia. Okay? We see over in Asia Minor, all these states coming along that are not Seleucid again. Okay? So Bactria becomes quite big. As we step along, Parthia starts growing bigger and bigger. Seleucids start losing territory. Parthia gets bigger, takes more of the Seleucids' territory. Again, bigger. Rome getting bigger. On the Italian peninsula now, they've taken over parts of Spain. They've taken over a lot of the northern coast of the Mediterranean. The Parthian Empire is getting bigger in blue. The Seleucid Empire is just a little bitty thing. The Treaty of Apamea has really decimated the Seleucid Empire at this point. They hamstrung, they first of all disallowed them from having elephants in the treaty, and then as they went along in time, the Romans would come in and hamstring their elephants. If they got more elephants, they would hamstring them, so they couldn't use them. They would destroy their ships. They just completely kept the Seleucids crushed down throughout all this time. And what could the Seleucids do? The only thing they could do is get smaller. They couldn't defend themselves, basically, to all the kingdoms around them. The Parthians, the Romans, whoever came along, the Seleucids couldn't do much because of the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC. So the Seleucids getting smaller and smaller, Parthia getting bigger and bigger, Rome getting bigger and bigger. The Carthaginian Empire is pretty much gone at this point. Notice Rome's getting bigger, Parthia gets bigger, Bactria goes away. Rome taking over almost, the entire northern coast now. As we go along, we see Parthia getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And guess what? Rome has created a monster. They have to deal with Parthia now. Now, their modus operandi was they would go in and conquer lands, but they would like to wait until they were ready to do so, okay? They were okay with conquering the Seleucids. They weren't ready yet. That's why the Treaty of Apamea was so important to the Romans, because they could crush the Seleucids and keep them in check and make their kingdom small. They could handle little kingdoms. They could handle, at the time, they could have handled Parthia, they could have handled Bactria, but they couldn't handle the Seleucids, who were at the time getting ready to take Egypt. Remember, we talked about that last week, okay? The day of Eleusis. All right, Rome takes off, goes even up into the British Isles. And then we see in 40 BC, Rome must start dealing with Parthia. We see again with Herod the Great, Mark Antony, and others. Now we see that Egypt falls. Cleopatra and Mark Antony are killed. Boom, there it goes. Rome takes over Egypt. We step along, and then in 1 BC, we have the end of our period and the beginning of the New Testament. Now, during the time of the Seleucids, they renamed Cold Syria into 5 different sections: Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Perea, and Trachonitis. Judea actually went and looked in several different versions of the Bible. I've got a Bible program I can search. I searched for the word Judea. I didn't find it. It actually kind of surprised me. How many in here still call Research Park Boulevard Rideout Road? Yeah. I figured in the Bible, surely, Judea became Judea in AD 6 with the banishment of Herod Herod Archelaus, okay, in AD 6. We'll talk about that history as we get into the Herods in a couple of weeks, okay? So when he was banished, they combined these 3 regions, Judea, Samaria, Idumea, into one region called Iudea, or Judea, and that is what we see in the Bible. So I figured there'd be some leftovers of that as they translate, as people were talking, in the New Testament times, and as the people wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, wrote their Gospels and whatever, they still talk about Judea, because I still talk about Rideout Road, But that wasn't the case. In the Bible, it's always Judea. I thought that was kind of interesting, okay? 44 references to Judea, not Judea. 12 references to Samaria, 65 to Galilee. Perea is not mentioned in the New Testament. I thought that was kind of interesting, at least in the versions that I looked at. We know that Jesus had a Perean ministry. We talk about that all the time. If we talk about Jesus' life, we talk about the Perean ministry quite often. Perea is mostly mentioned in Josephus' Wars and Antiquities. And typically in the New Testament, and even the Old Testament, it talks about beyond the Jordan, or beyond Jordan, or Gilead. Gilead was the same as Perea. It was the other side of the Jordan, the eastern side of the Jordan River. Trachonitis, there's one reference in the New Testament. As I mentioned, all these 3 regions became Iudea in AD 6. The Jerusalem capital, or the capital was moved from Jerusalem in AD 6 to Caesarea. Caesarea specifically, Caesarea Maritima, okay? The one on the coast that you can go see today. Very interesting place to visit. Beyond our scope in this class, Judea was combined with Galilee in AD 132 to form Syria Palestina, which has happened after the Bar Kokhba revolt around 132 AD. So these are the regions that we've been talking about: Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Perea, Trachonitis. Those regions were combined or named in the time of the Seleucids. All right. So that is the wrap-up of the Syrian, Seleucid, Parthian, Bactrian empires, okay? Just to know that those other empires are out there, not to get so focused in on what we're doing, but you've got to realize that there's a whole rest of the world going on at the same time. It's good stuff. Next week, please be here. Thank y'all.